So we're beginning week 5 of biblical interpretation. This week, you're going to be reading chapters 4, 5, and 6 in Ben Witherington's book, Reading and Understanding the Bible. There are a variety of different genres in the Bible, and that's what you're going to be reading about. I like to think about what we do when we sort mail or we sort our emails. We look and we see the junk emails, and a lot of times we recognize them right away by maybe what's in the subject heading or who they're from, and we don't even read those. We toss them in the recycling or we put them in our junk email file, and that's it. The second category of emails or emails or letters that we get are bills. And those, we don't read the whole thing, but they are important. And so we glance at them, we look at how much we owe and when it's due. And then we put it in a place where we're going to remember to pay that bill, and that's all. If you're like me, you don't read all that fine print every single month. The third kinds of letters and emails that we get are from friends and family. And when we get those, we read everything because these are people we care about. These are people we love. There's also work emails, and you probably have different ways of categorizing those depending on who they're from. In the same way, the Bible is a whole bunch of different kinds of writing. And I don't mean to say that we don't read every word of the Bible, but we do have to read those words in different ways. We have to have different approaches. And so that's what Dr. Witherington is going to teach us this week. This week's reading is pretty packed with information. So you're going to want to set aside a good chunk of time to do your reading because these 3 chapters are dense. Chapter 4 talks about figurative language and the law. So figurative language is when we compare one thing to another. And I'm going to show you an example not only of figurative language, but of the way Hebrew poetry works using Psalm 1. So Psalm 1 starts out, "The truly happy person doesn't follow wicked advice, doesn't stand on the road of sinners, and doesn't sit with the disrespectful." So notice those 3 lines in that verse. Doesn't follow wicked advice, doesn't stand on the road of sinners, and doesn't sit with the disrespectful. That's a kind of parallelism where Hebrew repeats the same idea 3 different times. There are 3 different kinds of parallelism in Hebrew poetry, and that's the first one. Instead of doing those things, these persons love the Lord's instruction, and they recite God's instruction day and night. Again, we have the same kind of parallelism. Because they love the Lord's instructions, they recite it day and night. That's intended to be equivalent, to be saying the same thing 2 different ways. They are like a tree, replanted by streams of water, which bears fruit at just the right time, and whose leaves don't fade. Whatever they do succeeds. Here we have figurative language. This is called a simile, and the author is comparing the people who do good things to a tree. So one of the ways we can handle figurative language is by thinking about, why is the author making this comparison? What does he mean by saying that righteous people are like trees? Maybe he wants to say that they're sturdy. Maybe he wants to say that they bear good fruit. And so then the question becomes, well, why didn't he just say that? Why didn't he just say, well, righteous people, they're sturdy, they're dependable, and good things come from their lives? What did the author gain by making the simile that he couldn't have had if he had said it the other way? So we can think about figurative language in that way and ask ourselves that question and see if we can come up with an answer. Verse 4, that's not true for the wicked. They're like dust that the wind blows away. Here we have the second kind of Hebrew parallelism, where one phrase says they are like dust, another simile, and then the next stanza adds something to it, that the wind blows away. What kind of dust? That the wind blows away. And that's why the wicked will have no standing in the court of justice, neither will sinners in the assembly of the righteous. Again, we have the parallelism where the author says the same thing twice. And then in the last verse, we have the third kind of parallelism. The Lord is intimately acquainted with the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked is destroyed. Here we have opposites. The author says one thing in the first half, and then he says the exact opposite in the second. So watch for those three kinds of Hebrew parallelism, particularly when you read the Psalms. The other thing that Witherington talks about in chapter 4 is the law. One of the most exciting things for me that I learned about ancient Hebrew law, and particularly covenants, which was the ancient form of contracts, was this idea of a historical preamble. When I used to read the Old Testament, I would read the story of God and the Israelites, and I'd be going along hearing the story. And then I'd come to this place where God is making a covenant with them, and the passage would start by retelling the story I had just read. And I used to get really frustrated and think, we know all that. You already told us all this. Why are you telling us this again? Until I learned that the reason that that kind of rehearsing, retelling of the story of the relationship of the people involved in the covenant was the basis on which the covenant was founded. So even though in the covenant there are consequences for breaking a covenant, in the ancient world there wasn't a lawyer you could go to and sue the person who broke the covenant with you. So you had to be careful who you entered a covenant with. And so at the beginning of the covenant, the parties would rehearse their previous history. Well, my grandfather helped your grandfather when he was in need, and your father helped my father when my father had some need in his life. And on that basis, on the basis of the history between our two families, we're going to trust each other enough to make this covenant. That's why that story gets retold. And that just completely changed those parts of the Bible for me and helped and they became interesting to me, and I enjoyed watching them, or reading them, sorry. Okay, so that's chapter 4. Chapter 5 talks about wisdom. What I learned about wisdom literature in seminary is that Psalms and Proverbs tell us the way things are supposed to go, and then there's Job. Because Proverbs and some of the Psalms say, act right and good things will happen. And if all is right with the world, that is the way things run. However, we're human beings, and we are tempted to say, oh, if when I act right, good things happen, then it makes sense that if good things are happening to me, it must be because I acted right. Think about the song Something Good from The Sound of Music. They've fallen in love and life is wonderful, so there must have been something good that they did as children to bring about this good thing that's happening now. And then we also assume that if bad things happen to you, it must be because you did something bad. And Psalms and Proverbs are not meant to teach those things. In fact, Job teaches us that instead, bad things do happen to good people. The world is not that simple. So I find that a helpful way to think about wisdom literature. Chapter 6 in Witherington's book addresses the fact that the Bible was meant to be read aloud. And so just like if you were in debate class in high school, you learned different techniques and methods of persuasion, the ancient world also had methods of persuasion, and Witherington goes into great detail about some of those. I just want to mention a couple of things from his chapter. The first one, and this kind of tickles me, is that in the ancient world, new was bad and old was good. So there's a couple of ancient texts that I've read that are kind of hilarious to read from our perspective, because we are so used to the commercials that come on TV and say, oh, you should try this because it's new. And we think, yes, it's new. It must be better. In the ancient world, it was the exact opposite. And so when people would write to other people, they would say, oh, you really don't want to get involved in that because you know that's new. But this old thing that has been going on forever, well, you can trust that because it's old. And so that's a really important piece of information to bring with us when we read the Bible, to recognize that in the ancient world, new was bad and old was good. The second thing are three techniques of persuasion in the ancient world, and the Greek words that we use to talk about them are ethos, pathos, and logos. So ethos is actually a logical fallacy. Ethos is the idea that you're going to believe somebody and trust their words if their character is good. Now, the reason that's actually a logical fallacy is that when someone says something, even a liar, if a liar says something, you can't automatically think to yourself, this can't be true. A liar is saying it. Because we know that even liars tell the truth sometimes. And so each claim has to be investigated on its own merit. However, it is the case that if we are the speaker, we know that people are more likely to trust us and more likely to believe us if we have good character. And so one of the goals in ancient speech was to persuade people that your character was good. We see this in John 21:24, where an unknown we ends the gospel by saying, this is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. We don't know who that we is, but whoever it is, they are telling the reader, you can believe this gospel because we know this guy and we know that he tells the truth. You can trust his character. The second technique is pathos. Here, think of Hallmark commercials, where you're watching a movie and the Hallmark commercial comes on, and all of a sudden you find yourself crying because it has touched your heart. And speakers know that if they can touch the listener's heart, they are more likely to persuade them. So we have in the book of Philemon, verses 9 and 10, Paul says, I prefer to appeal to you on the basis of love. It is as none other than Paul, an old man and now also a prisoner of Christ Jesus, that I appeal to you for my son Onesimus, who became my son when I was in chains. Can you hear the violins behind Paul's words there as he tries to touch the heart of Philemon so that he can persuade him to do what he wants him to do? Finally, we have logos, logical reasoning, and that exists in the Bible as well. The example I picked was 1 John 1, verses 5 through 7. God is light. In him there is no darkness at all. If we claim to have fellowship with him and yet walk in the darkness, we lie and do not live out the truth. But if we walk in the light, as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus his Son purifies us from all sin. That's an example of logos, logical reasoning. So enjoy your reading this week. I will see you on the discussion boards. Be sure and remember to leave time for the reading because it might take you a little extra time this time. And otherwise, take care. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.